The spotlight was hot enough to make sweat bead at the base of Dean Martin's spine, but his face showed nothing. He stood center stage at the Stardust Lounge, microphone in hand, while Carlo Benedetti sat 30 feet away in the VIP section with his arms crossed and his eyes dead. The room had gone quiet in the wrong way. Not the attentive silence before a punchline, but the suffocating quiet that comes when 200 people realize they're about to witness something they'll have to pretend they didn't see. Benedetti hadn't moved in 3 minutes, hadn't laughed, hadn't even blinked. He'd just sat there, a 52-year-old man in a charcoal suit with silver cufflinks that caught the light every time he adjusted his position, and he'd made the entire room understand through his stillness that Dean Martin, the king of cool, the man who'd sung for presidents and made Las Vegas his kingdom, was being erased in real time. Carlo Benedetti had built his reputation on moments like these. Not through violence, though violence was always available to him. Not through shouting or spectacle. Through control. Through the careful orchestration of social pressure that left no fingerprints, no witnesses who could testify to anything more than discomfort. He'd learned early in his career that a man who makes you bleed can be arrested, but a man who makes you irrelevant owns you forever. In Chicago, he'd once destroyed a union organizer by having every shop owner on the South Side turn off their lights when the man walked past. No threats, no confrontations, just darkness block after block, until the organizer understood that he'd been removed from the world without anyone having to touch him. Benedetti had refined this technique over 30 years. He knew that humiliation, delivered publicly and precisely, rewired a person's nervous system in ways that violence never could. Because violence ends, humiliation replays itself in your mind every night for the rest of your life. The humiliation hadn't come through violence or insults. It had come through something far more brutal. Benedetti had instructed the entire VIP section, through a single gesture to his men, to turn their backs to the stage, not leave, not heckle, just turn. And one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, the men in expensive suits had rotated their chairs away from Dean Martin while he was mid-song. The rest of the room had watched it happen, had understood what it meant, and now they sat frozen, caught between two powers, waiting to see which one would force them to choose. Dean's hand was still wrapped around the microphone. His voice hadn't cracked, his smile hadn't faltered, but inside his chest, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a prisoner trying to break free, because he understood with perfect clarity that the next 60 seconds would determine whether he walked out of this room as Dean Martin or as a man who'd been publicly castrated by Carlo Benedetti and lived to sing about it. To understand how a moment like that becomes possible, you need to go back 4 days to a Tuesday afternoon when the warning first arrived. Dean had been in his suite at the Stardust, going over arrangements for Friday's show, when the call came through. Not from Benedetti himself, from a man named Morris Katz, the floor manager, a nervous wreck of a person who'd spent 20 years learning how to deliver bad news without getting blamed for it. Morris had knocked on the door at 3 in the afternoon with a bottle of scotch he hadn't been asked to bring, and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He'd poured 2 glasses without asking permission, which was already a bad sign, and then he'd said very carefully that Miss Benedetti would be attending Friday's show with some associates from Chicago. Important men, Men who appreciated respect. Men who expected a certain kind of performance. Clean, professional, nothing that could be misinterpreted as commentary on how certain businesses operated in certain cities. Dean had nodded along, his face neutral, his mind already cataloging every joke in his act that could possibly cross a line he couldn't see. Morris had finished his scotch in one swallow and left without saying goodbye, and Dean had sat alone in his suite for an hour, staring at the Las Vegas skyline and feeling something cold settle into his stomach. The thing about warnings delivered this way was that they weren't really warnings. They were notifications. You'd already been judged. The sentence had already been passed. You were just being informed about your execution date, so you could put your affairs in order. Wednesday brought the second escalation, though it took Dean half the day to realize it was an escalation at all. He'd gone down to the Stardust's main casino floor to grab lunch at the coffee shop, same as he did most days, and something had been different. Not obviously wrong, just different. The pit bosses hadn't made eye contact. The cocktail waitresses had smiled, but hadn't stopped to chat. The blackjack dealers had nodded but hadn't called out greetings. It was like watching a movie where the sound was half a second out of sync with the picture. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt right. By the time Dean made it back to his suite, he'd understood what was happening. The staff had been told. Not explicitly, no memo had been circulated, but word had spread the way word always spread in Vegas, through glances and silences and the sudden absence of small kindnesses. Carlo Benedetti was making a point, and Dean Martin was the canvas. And everyone who worked at the Stardust, from the valets to the vice presidents, had decided that their survival depended on not being associated with the wrong side of whatever was about to happen. Dean had spent Wednesday night alone in his dressing room, running through his act, cutting jokes, rewriting punchlines, trying to build a show that would satisfy a man he'd never met over a grievance he didn't understand. But every time he softened a line, made it safer, stripped out the edge that made it a Dean Martin joke, he felt something inside him die. He'd built his entire career on the illusion of not caring, on walking on stage with a drink in his hand and a shrug in his voice, and making the audience believe that whether they laughed or left, it was all the same to him. But that wasn't true. It had never been true. Dean cared desperately about the work, about the craft, about the respect he'd earned by refusing to bow to anyone, including Frank, including the studio heads, including the men with dead eyes and expensive suits who thought money and violence gave them the right to own people. And now one of those men was coming to his show, and Dean had to decide, did he care more about staying alive or about staying himself? Thursday afternoon, Dean had gone for a walk through the Stardust. Not to anywhere specific, just walking, trying to clear his head, trying to find some perspective that would make the choice easier. He'd ended up in the showroom, empty and dark except for the ghost light burning center stage. He'd stood there for 20 minutes looking at the rows of empty seats, at the VIP section where Carlo Benedetti would sit tomorrow night, at the microphone stand waiting in the spotlight. And he'd thought about his father's barber shop in Steubenville, about watching men with power come in and make his father small through nothing more than their presence, about learning early that there were two kinds of people in the world, those who made themselves invisible to survive, and those who refused to disappear and paid the price. Dean had spent his whole life trying to find a third option, a way to be visible without being vulnerable, to command attention without giving anyone power over him. He'd built his persona like armor, the drinking, the carelessness, the perpetual impression that none of it mattered. Because if you genuinely don't care, you can't be hurt. But standing in that empty showroom, Dean had realized the flaw in his armor. He did care, and Carlo Benedetti knew it. And tomorrow night, in front of 200 witnesses, Benedetti was going to prove it. Friday night arrived with the kind of electric tension that made the air in the Stardust lounge feel too thick to breathe. By 8 o'clock, every seat was filled. By 8:15, people were standing 3 deep at the bar, craning to see the stage. By 8:30, when the house lights dimmed and the orchestra started its overture, the energy in the room had shifted from anticipation to something darker. Everyone knew. No one knew exactly what, but they knew something was coming. Dean had watched from backstage, peering through the curtain, cataloging faces. The regulars were there, wealthy tourists, local high rollers, the usual Friday night crowd that came to be entertained and nothing more. But scattered throughout the room, like landmines in a field, were the others, men in dark suits with expressionless faces, men who sat too still, watched too carefully, communicated through glances instead of words. And in the center of the VIP section, at the best table in the house, sat Carlo Benedetti. He was smaller than Dean had expected, maybe 5'8", slender build, with silver hair combed back and a face that looked like it had been carved from marble and never learned how to move. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year, and cufflinks that caught the spotlight every time he lifted his glass. He didn't look angry, didn't look threatening. He looked like a man who'd come to watch something he'd already paid for, and he was waiting to see if he'd gotten his money's worth. The show started at 9. Dean walked on stage to thunderous applause, and for the first 20 minutes everything was perfect. The jokes landed, the songs soared, the audience was electric, laughing in all the right places, applauding after every number. Dean hadn't looked at Benedetti's table, not once. He'd kept his eyes on the balcony, on the far corners, on the anonymous faces that had come to see Dean Martin and nothing else. But he'd felt Benedetti's presence like a physical weight, like a gun pressed against the base of his skull, counting down the seconds until the trigger was pulled. Then, 23 minutes into the show, it happened. Dean had just finished a song and was transitioning into his next bit when he noticed Benedetti lean over to the man on his right. A whisper, a nod, and then the man stood up, turned his chair around so it faced away from the stage, and sat back down. Just like that, calm, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. 5 seconds later, the man on Benedetti's left did the same. Then the 2 men at the adjacent table. Then the couple behind them. One by one, like a choreographed performance, every person in the VIP section turned their chairs away from Dean Martin while he stood in the spotlight with a microphone in his hand and a frozen smile on his face. Benedetti had chosen this method for a reason. Turning chairs was elegant. It required no violence, no raised voices, no physical contact that could be interrupted or prevented. It was a rejection that existed purely in the realm of social physics, a mass of people choosing, in unison, to withdraw their attention from someone who depended on that attention to exist. It was the kind of humiliation that couldn't be undone through force or wit. You couldn't punch your way out of being ignored. You couldn't charm your way back into the field of vision of people who'd been instructed not to see you. And most importantly, it created a participatory cruelty. Every person in that VIP section who turned their chair became complicit. They couldn't later claim they'd just been sitting there. They'd acted. They'd chosen. And that choice would follow them out of the room and into every conversation they'd have about this night for the rest of their lives. The rest of the room noticed immediately. You could not notice. The VIP section had become a wall of backs, a coordinated rejection so precise and so public that it turned Dean Martin into a man performing for people who'd decided he wasn't worth watching. A few people in the general seating area laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of the act. Most stayed silent. The orchestra kept playing, but uncertainly, looking to Dean for a cue that didn't come. And Dean Martin stood there, center stage, bathed in light, and felt the humiliation land like a fist to the solar plexus. This wasn't about disagreeing with a joke. This wasn't about being offended or insulted. This was about power, about Carlo Benedetti demonstrating, in front of 200 witnesses, that he could erase Dean Martin from his own show, that he could turn the king of cool into a court jester performing for people who'd been instructed not to see him. A woman in the general seating area, third row center, felt her stomach turn. She was 53, wearing a black cocktail dress and pearls her husband had given her for their anniversary. She'd come to Vegas to escape her normal life for a weekend, to feel glamorous and carefree and young again. She'd been excited to see Dean Martin, had told her friends back home that she had tickets to his show, and now she was watching him be humiliated in real time, and she didn't know what to do. Should she clap? Should she leave? Should she pretend this was all part of the performance? She looked at her husband, but he was staring at his drink, his face carefully neutral, and she realized with a sick clarity that they were both choosing, right now, through their silence, to let this happen. In the balcony, a high roller named Jack Reardon recognized what was happening because he'd seen it before. 3 years ago in Miami, a club owner who'd refused to sell to the right people. One night, during his busiest shift, every regular customer had walked in, ordered nothing, and left. For 6 hours, the owner had understood the message, had sold the next week for a quarter of what it was worth. Jack knew this playbook. He knew that Benedetti was giving Dean Martin a choice, right now bend or break. And Jack knew from experience that most people bent. It was easier. It hurt less. And the thing about bending was that you could convince yourself later that you'd made a smart decision. That survival was a form of winning. Jack took a drink, looked at the wall of backs in the VIP section, and waited to see what Dean Martin was made of. Near the kitchen entrance, a cocktail waitress named Rita stood frozen with a tray of drinks, watching the stage. She'd worked at the Stardust for 7 years, had served Benedetti and his people a dozen times, had learned through careful observation that the trick to surviving around men like that was to be useful without being memorable, to smile without making eye contact, to move through their field of vision like furniture, present, functional, ignorable. She knew Dean Martin, too, had served him drinks backstage, had heard him practice, had seen the way he treated staff like people instead of props. And now she was watching him stand alone in that spotlight, and she wanted to do something, say something, walk over to the VIP section and tell them all to turn their chairs around. But she didn't move, because she had rent due next week, and a mother in a nursing home in Henderson, and noble gestures didn't pay for either of those things. The silence stretched 5 seconds, 10, 15. Long enough for everyone in the room to understand that they were witnessing something significant, something they'd have to decide later whether to remember or forget. Time stopped being time. It became something thicker, more viscous, stretching each second into an eternity. Dean could hear his own breathing, could hear the blood rushing in his ears, could hear, somewhere very far away, the hum of the air conditioning and the clink of ice in someone's glass. His throat had gone completely dry. His fingers had started to tingle from gripping the microphone stand too hard. The spotlight felt like it was burning through his skull, and in the back of his mind, a voice was screaming at him to move, to speak, to do something that would end this moment before it consumed him entirely. But Dean's body wouldn't obey. He stood frozen, locked in place by the terrible weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching him fail. The orchestra's violin section had stopped playing. Then the brass, then the piano. One by one, the musicians had lost their nerve, unable to sustain the charade that this was still a performance. Now there was only silence and the sound of Dean's breathing and the unbearable pressure of time refusing to move forward. Dean's hand stayed wrapped around the microphone. His smile stayed frozen in place. But inside his chest, his heart was screaming at him to do something. To walk off stage, to make a joke, to acknowledge the insult, to fight back, to surrender, to do anything that would end this moment and let everyone move on. But Dean didn't move. He stood there, perfectly still, and let the room sit inside its own discomfort. And then, very slowly, he did something no one expected. He turned his chair, not away from the audience, toward it. There was a stool on stage, a prop he sometimes used during ballads. Dean walked over to it, picked it up, carried it to center stage, and sat down facing the VIP section, facing the wall of backs that Carlo Benedetti had created, and he began to sing, not a song from his set list, a buy it, intimate, the kind of song you sang when there was one person in the room and you needed them to hear every word. He sang it directly to the backs of the chairs in the VIP section, his voice soft and clear, and he didn't look away. Not once. The room held its breath, because everyone understood what Dean was doing. He was creating witnesses. He was making every single person in that showroom consciously aware that they were participating in this moment, that they were watching Carlo Benedetti humiliate a performer, and they were watching Dean Martin refuse to be humiliated, that this wasn't between Dean and Benedetti anymore. This was between all of them and their own complicity. Dean sang for 2 minutes. The orchestra followed his lead, soft and steady, and during those 2 minutes, something shifted in the Stardust Lounge. It started small. A woman in the third row who stopped looking at her drink and started looking at Benedetti's table. Then a man in the balcony who leaned forward, his face tight with something that looked like shame. Then more. People who'd been staring at their hands or the tablecloths or anywhere except the stage, now looking directly at the wall of backs in the VIP section, seeing it, really seeing it, not as a joke, not as a power move, but as what it actually was. A roomful of grown adults turning their backs on a man who was singing his heart out because someone with money and muscle had told them to. And in that moment, Carlo Benedetti realized what Dean had done. He'd expected Dean to break, to walk off stage or plead, or make a joke that acknowledged the power dynamic and confirmed Benedetti's control. That's what performers did. They folded. They found a way to spin the humiliation into part of the act, to laugh it off, to survive by surrendering. But Dean hadn't done that. Dean had flipped the entire interaction. He'd made Benedetti's power move visible, had turned it from an invisible pressure into a physical, observable fact that everyone in the room had to confront. And in doing so, Dean had made Benedetti the performer, the one on display, the one whose actions were being judged. Benedetti felt it before he could articulate it. The subtle shift in the room's attention. People weren't watching Dean anymore. They were watching Benedetti, watching to see what he'd do next, watching to see if he'd escalate or back down or find some face-saving middle ground, and Benedetti understood, with the cold precision of a man who'd built his life on reading power dynamics, that he'd lost control of the narrative. Violence was impossible in this moment. He couldn't have Dean dragged off stage or beaten in the parking lot, because too many people were watching now. Too many witnesses who'd remember not what Dean said, but what Benedetti did. And if Benedetti sat there, stone-faced, refusing to turn around, refusing to acknowledge that anything had changed, he'd look weak, rigid, small, like a man so fragile that a singer's ballad could rattle him. Dean finished the song, let the last note hang in the air, and then he stood up, walked back to the microphone, and spoke for the first time since the chairs had turned. "You know," Dean said, his voice conversational, like he was ordering coffee, "I've played a lot of rooms in my time. Vegas, New York, Chicago. And I've learned something important." He paused, looked directly at the back of Carlo Benedetti's head. The quieter the room gets, the louder everyone hears what's not being said. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating quiet from before. It was different, sharper, like the air itself had changed composition. And then someone started clapping. Not loud, not defiant, just steady. A woman in the general seating area, middle-aged, wearing pearls. She clapped slowly, deliberately, like she was making a decision with every contact of her palms. Then the man next to her joined. Then someone in the balcony. Then more. Not everyone. Not even half. But enough. Enough that the sound filled the room and made it impossible to ignore. Carlo Benedetti sat motionless for exactly 8 seconds. He was doing math in his head, calculating the cost of every possible response. If he stood and walked out, he'd look defeated. If he stayed facing away, he'd look petty. If he had his men move on Dean, he'd confirm everything Dean had just made the room see. Every option was a loss. The only question was which loss he could afford. Then he turned his chair back around, slow, deliberate. His face showed nothing. He picked up his drink, took a sip, and placed it back on the table with a soft clink that somehow carried across the entire room. Then he nodded. Once, just a slight tilt of his head. The gesture was so small that half the room probably missed it. But Dean saw it. And the men in dark suits saw it. And everyone in the VIP section saw it. And one by one the chairs turned back around. The wall of backs dissolved. The audience reappeared. And Dean Martin, still standing in the spotlight with his hands steady and his voice calm, said, "Know where were we?" and launched into his next song like nothing had happened. The rest of the show was perfect. The audience laughed and applauded and sang along, and by the time Dean took his final bow, you could almost believe the whole thing had been planned. Almost, but everyone in that room knew better. They'd seen something that night, something about power and silence and the strange alchemy that happens when a man refuses to give you the reaction you paid for. Dean made it backstage on legs that felt like water. He closed the dressing room door, locked it, and collapsed into the chair in front of his mirror. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the armrests to keep them still. He'd just survived. He knew that. But he also knew how close he'd come to the other thing. The knock came 10 minutes later. Dean's entire body tensed. But it wasn't Benedetti's men. It was Morris Katz, the floor manager, holding a bottle of scotch and looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last 2 hours. Morris poured 2 glasses without speaking. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Morris said, "I thought you were going to die up there." Dean picked up his glass, took a drink. "Yeah," he said quietly. "M2. "So why didn't you just walk off?" Morris asked. Dean looked at him, his eyes red, his face showing all the fear he'd hidden on stage. "Because then I'd have to walk off every stage for the rest of my life." They sat in the silence after that, letting the weight of it settle. Then Morris stood up, squeezed Dean's shoulder once, and left without another word. The story spread through Las Vegas like wildfire. By Saturday morning, every performer in town knew what had happened at the Stardust. By Sunday, it had reached Los Angeles. By the end of the month, it had become legend. The night Dean Martin turned Carlo Benedetti's power move into a public humiliation without raising his voice or throwing a punch. But like all legends, the story got simplified in the retelling. It got cleaner, more heroic, less terrifying. People said Dean had stared Benedetti down with ice in his veins, that he delivered a devastating one-liner that broke Benedetti on the spot, that he'd walked onto that stage knowing exactly what would happen and had a plan for every moment. Some versions claimed Dean had planted people in the audience to start the applause. Others said Benedetti had apologized backstage, though no one could name a witness. The legend made Dean fearless, made the victory inevitable, made it seem like cool and charm were enough to defeat power as long as you had enough of both. But that wasn't what happened. What happened was simpler and more terrifying. Dean Martin had been absolutely terrified, had stood on that stage with his heart trying to break through his ribs and his hands shaking and his throat closing up, convinced he was about to be destroyed in front of 200 people. He hadn't had a plan, hadn't known what would work, had just made a decision in real time based on nothing more than instinct and desperation, to refuse to give Carlo Benedetti the satisfaction of watching him break. The victory hadn't been inevitable. It had been a coin flip, a gamble, a moment where the room could have just as easily sided with power over principle, where the silence could have stretched until Dean had no choice but to walk off stage in defeat. The legend erased all of that, made it clean, made it safe, made it a story about cleverness instead of what it actually was, a story about a terrified man who chose honesty over survival and got lucky enough that the room chose with him. Dean Martin had refused to give Carlo Benedetti the satisfaction of a reaction. He'd let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. He'd created witnesses, forced every person in that room to see themselves as participants rather than spectators. And he'd trusted that eventually the room would understand what he understood, that sometimes not answering makes everyone else talk. The humiliation hadn't landed on Dean. It had boomeranged back onto the person who'd tried to inflict it, because Dean had made it impossible to ignore what was actually happening. The legend got one thing right, though. After that night, Dean Martin's reputation changed. Not because he'd been fearless. He hadn't been. He'd been terrified. But he'd learned something that most people never figure out, that silence, wielded correctly, is the most devastating weapon in the world. Because when you stop talking, everyone else has to listen to what they're really saying. If you were in that room that night, what would you have done? Would you have turned your chair with the VIP section? Or would you have been the first to turn it back? Sometimes the most important questions are the ones that make you uncomfortable. And if this story made you think about power and silence and the choices we make when no one's watching, there might be other stories here worth your time.